4,000 years ago, the Egyptians wrote a manual for the dead. They called it the Book of Coming Forth by Day. We call it the Book of the Dead. Most people who have heard of it imagine a superstition, a collection of spells meant to guide a soul through the underworld toward judgment. What almost no one asks is a simpler question. Why did a civilization spend centuries refining a document whose entire purpose was to train a mind to face its own judgment without flinching? Carl Jung spent his life studying exactly that structure inside living people. He called it individuation, the long and often brutal process of integrating the parts of yourself you would rather not look at. He called the parts you refuse to look at the shadow. He called the mask you show the world the persona. What the Egyptians encoded in ritual, Jung encoded in psychology. This video is not about mythology. It is about what happens when an ancient discipline of self-confrontation is read as a training program for the subconscious, and what it can still teach anyone who is tired of being run by impulses they never chose. Every ritual in the Book of the Dead assumes one thing that modern people resist: that the self is not one thing. It is a court case, a weighing, a negotiation between what you did and what you claim to be. That is not ancient superstition. That is the exact architecture Jung found in the human psyche 3,000 years later, sitting in his consulting room in Zurich, listening to patients describe dreams full of judges, gates, and scales they could not explain. Strip away the gods for a moment and look at the structure. The Book of the Dead is not a story. It is a sequence of instructions. Say this phrase before this gate. Recite this declaration before this guardian. Know the name of this creature or it will devour you. This is procedural knowledge, the same kind of knowledge a soldier drills into muscle memory or a surgeon rehearses before an operation. The Egyptians were not asking their dead to believe something. They were asking them to perform something repeatedly until it became automatic. Jung would recognize this instantly. He spent decades arguing that belief without repetition changes nothing in a person. What changes a person is ritual, repeated confrontation with the same material until the unconscious absorbs it. A person who reads about willpower once has learned a fact. A person who rehearses a discipline daily has installed a program. Think of the coworker who reads a leadership book over a weekend and quotes it for a month, then reverts entirely under the first real pressure. The book gave him information. It did not give him a rehearsed structure. The Egyptians understood that the difference between information and transformation is repetition performed with consequence attached, which is exactly what the Book of the Dead demanded of anyone who wanted to pass. A single reading of a sacred text was never treated as sufficient. Initiates copied it, recited it, and lived alongside it for years, because the priesthood already understood something that modern self-improvement culture keeps forgetting, that the mind does not update itself from exposure alone. It updates from repetition under stakes it cannot ignore. The central image of the entire text is the scale. On one side sits the heart of the deceased. On the other sits a feather, the symbol of Ma'at, truth and order. If the heart is heavier than the feather, weighed down by unexamined guilt, cruelty, or self-deception, it is devoured on the spot. This is not a metaphor invented for children. It is a description of what happens to a person who has never confronted their own conscience honestly. Jung wrote about this constantly, though he used different vocabulary. He said that what you do not make conscious will control your life from the outside, and you will call it fate. The Egyptian scale is a literal image of that principle. The heart carries the unexamined weight. The feather is the lightness of a person who has actually done the work of self-examination. Picture a man who spends 15 years avoiding one honest conversation with his father. He tells himself he has moved past it. He has not weighed his own heart. He has simply avoided the scale. The weight does not disappear because it goes unmeasured. It shows up later, in his marriage, in his temper, in decisions he cannot explain even to himself. The Egyptians would say his heart was never weighed. Jung would say his shadow was never integrated. Both descriptions point to the same failure, the refusal to look honestly at what you carry. What makes this particularly dangerous is that the avoidance often looks like peace from the outside. The man appears calm, even successful, and everyone around him assumes the old wound closed on its own. Only the people closest to him ever feel the weight indirectly, in the sudden coldness that arrives from nowhere, in the arguments that seem to be about something small but carry the force of something much older. Before the scale, the deceased recites the negative confessions, a list of 42 declarations, each one a denial of a specific wrongdoing. I have not stolen. I have not lied. I have not caused another to weep. What is striking is not the content but the method. The dead person does not simply hope to be judged well. They actively rehearse, out loud, a precise accounting of restraint. This is a discipline of naming exactly what you refuse to do, which forces a person to first know exactly what they were capable of doing. You cannot honestly deny a temptation you never admitted feeling. This is where Jung's concept of the persona becomes dangerous if misunderstood. The persona is the socially acceptable mask, the version of yourself you present at work, at family dinners, in public. A person who only performs the mask and never rehearses the confession behind it becomes brittle. Consider the manager who is unfailingly polite in every meeting but privately resents every person on his team. He has built a persona with no confession behind it. The Egyptian ritual insists on the opposite order: know the impulse first, then declare your restraint of it. That order is what makes the restraint real instead of cosmetic. Modern behavioral science calls it implementation intentions, the practice of pre-deciding your response to a temptation before you face it. The Egyptian priest who trained initiates in the 42 declarations was doing exactly this, thousands of years before the term existed. Each declaration is rehearsed so many times before death that, in theory, the response becomes reflexive rather than deliberated. This is subconscious programming in its oldest recorded form, not mysticism, repetition engineering. A person who has never rehearsed a response to provocation will improvise one under pressure, and improvisation under pressure tends to default to whatever the shadow has been storing. This is why a normally calm person can suddenly explode at a family gathering over something trivial. There was no rehearsed declaration standing between the provocation and the reaction. The Egyptians built an entire liturgy specifically to prevent that gap from existing. Jung's model of the psyche is layered: the conscious ego on top, the personal unconscious beneath it holding repressed material, and the collective unconscious beneath that holding inherited patterns he called archetypes. The Egyptian underworld journey mirrors this layering almost exactly, a descent through successive gates, each guarded by a figure that must be named and answered correctly. You do not simply walk through the underworld. You are tested at every layer. Think of a person going through a difficult breakup. The first layer of pain is obvious: grief, anger, replaying conversations. That is the surface gate. Underneath it is an older pattern, perhaps a childhood fear of abandonment that this breakup only reactivated. That is a deeper gate, guarded by something the person must name honestly before they can move past it. Most people stop at the first gate. They treat the grief as the whole problem and never descend to name what the grief is actually standing on. Anubis, jackal-headed, stands beside the scale as the one who performs the weighing. He is not cruel. He is precise. He does not editorialize the result. He simply measures. This is a useful image for anyone navigating office politics, because most workplace conflict comes from people who refuse to weigh their own contribution honestly and instead demand that others weigh it for them, usually in their favor. The employee who blames a missed deadline entirely on a colleague, while quietly aware that he delayed his own portion of the work by 3 days, has skipped his own Anubis. He has appointed himself both the accused and the judge, and unsurprisingly acquitted himself. The Egyptian ritual insists the weighing is external, precise, and indifferent to your preferred narrative about yourself. A disciplined mind performs that same indifferent weighing internally before anyone else has to do it for them. Osiris is murdered, dismembered, and reassembled before becoming ruler of the underworld. The myth is not about resurrection as a reward. It is about reconstruction as a requirement. Osiris cannot rule the dead until he has been broken apart and rebuilt in a new form. Jung's concept of individuation follows an identical shape. A person cannot integrate their full self without first suffering a kind of psychological dismemberment, an encounter with parts of themselves that were previously scattered, denied, or exiled. A person who loses a career they built their entire identity around often describes the experience as a kind of death. What the Egyptian myth suggests, and what Jung confirmed clinically, is that the person who refuses to let that identity die simply carries the corpse of an old self indefinitely. The ones who eventually rebuild something more solid are the ones who let the dismemberment happen fully instead of fighting to reassemble the old shape exactly as it was. Osiris does not return to his old body. He returns transformed, ruling a different realm entirely, and this detail is easy to miss precisely because it is uncomfortable. Most people facing collapse want restoration of what was lost, not transformation into something unfamiliar. The myth is blunt about which of the two is actually on offer. Egyptian psychology divided the self into multiple parts: the Ka, a kind of vital double, and the Ba, the personality that could move independently after death. Two selves coexisting, sometimes in tension. This is not far from Jung's insistence that the ego is only one part of the self, and that a person who identifies entirely with their ego mistakes a fragment for the whole. Consider a friendship where one person performs constant availability, always agreeing, always accommodating, while privately harboring exhaustion and resentment they never voice. The performed self is the ka, functional, visible, dutiful. The resentful self is the ba, moving independently underneath, unacknowledged. Eventually the ba surfaces, usually in a moment that looks disproportionate to whoever is on the receiving end, because they never saw the second self operating the whole time. The dead were buried with amulets, the scarab over the heart, the eye of Horus for protection, each object serving as a physical anchor for a specific intention. This is not different in principle from a modern habit cue, a ring worn to remind someone of a commitment, a specific object on a desk that signals the start of focused work. The Egyptians were not being decorative. They understood that abstract intentions fade without a physical trigger to reattach them to. A person trying to control their temper who relies purely on willpower in the moment of provocation is working without an anchor. A person who has trained themselves to touch a specific object or take one specific breath, the instant they feel anger rising, has built an amulet in the modern sense, a physical cue that reroutes an automatic reaction before it completes itself. The Egyptians never assumed intention alone was reliable under pressure, which is precisely why the amulet was physical rather than purely verbal. A thought can be talked out of existing in a moment of stress. An object in the hand is harder to argue away. Priests did not wait for death to rehearse these texts. Portions of the Book of the Dead were recited during life, in temple training, long before anyone needed them for a literal underworld journey. The discipline was meant to be lived, not merely prepared for. This detail is usually skipped in popular retellings, but it is the entire point. You do not wait until the crisis to discover whether your character holds. A parent who wants to raise a child with restraint and honesty cannot simply announce those values during a single serious conversation. The child learns from the 10,000 small repetitions at the dinner table, the parent's own weighing of their temper in traffic, the small daily confessions of fault that the parent models without announcing them as lessons. The Egyptian priest trained for decades before ever needing the ritual. Character is built the same way in the ordinary repetitions no one is watching. Modern psychology tends to treat fear of judgment as purely destructive, something to be dissolved through self-acceptance. The Egyptians took a more complicated view. Fear of the weighing was not meant to be eliminated. It was meant to be structured into something useful, a disciplined awareness that consequences exist and that self-deception has a cost. Jung himself warned against therapy that simply flatters a patient into feeling better without confronting what needs confronting. Comfort without honesty produces a person who feels fine and remains exactly as unintegrated as before. An employee who receives only encouragement and never honest feedback about a real weakness will walk out of every review feeling validated and improving nowhere. The manager who tells him the truth, precisely and without cruelty, is performing something closer to the Egyptian weighing than the endless affirmation his ego would prefer. Growth requires an accurate scale, not a flattering one. Egyptian ritual placed enormous weight on saying the correct words at the correct moment, no more, no less. Silence between declarations was not empty space. It was part of the discipline. Modern life has largely lost this instinct. People speak reflexively, filling every silence, reacting to every provocation immediately, and mistaking constant verbal output for honesty. A person who has trained themselves to pause before responding to an insult, rather than firing back instantly, is practicing a version of the same discipline the Egyptians encoded into their gates and declarations. The pause is not weakness. It is the interval in which the confession can actually be chosen rather than blurted, which is precisely why the ritual insisted on it. Among the 42 declarations is a denial of envy toward another's success. This particular confession is rarely discussed because it exposes something people prefer to hide even from themselves. Jung considered envy one of the most stubborn shadow contents precisely because it disguises itself as other emotions, irritation, dismissiveness, sudden coldness toward a friend's good news. A friend who goes quiet and vaguely critical the moment another friend gets promoted has likely never confessed the envy to himself. He experiences it instead as a series of small justified complaints about the friend's character. The Egyptian declaration forces the confession into the open, out loud, specifically named, which is the only way Jung believed shadow material could ever be diffused instead of acted out sideways. The elaborate process of preserving the body was never really about vanity. It was a refusal to let entropy have the final, unexamined word. Every stage of mummification was deliberate, ordered, resistant to the natural pull toward disorder. This mirrors something Jung observed in personality itself, that without deliberate maintenance, character does not stay neutral, it decays toward whatever is easiest, toward avoidance, toward the path requiring the least confrontation with the self. A person who once held firm principles but stopped examining them gradually finds those principles eroding, not through one dramatic betrayal but through years of small unexamined compromises. Nobody mummifies their integrity by accident. It requires the same deliberate, unglamorous maintenance the Egyptians gave to the body, or it decays exactly the way anything untended decays. Notice that the scale in the underworld is not operated by the deceased. It is operated by forces beyond them, yet the outcome depends entirely on choices already made in life. This is a subtle but important distinction. The Egyptians were not describing an external judge who could be persuaded or negotiated with after the fact. The weighing simply reveals what was already true. Nothing said in the moment changes the weight of the heart. This maps precisely onto what Jung meant by psychological integrity. A person cannot talk their way out of an unintegrated shadow in a moment of crisis. The relationship that collapses under pressure was already weakened long before the argument that finally broke it. The scale does not care about the eloquence of your closing statement. It only reflects the weight that accumulated while no one was watching. This is why people are so often blindsided by their own endings. They remember the final argument in vivid detail and mistake it for the cause, when the argument was only the moment the accumulated weight finally became visible to everyone, including themselves. Each gate in the underworld journey is guarded by a specific creature demanding a specific name be spoken correctly. Fail to name the guardian and passage is denied. This structure suggests something practical, that boundaries are not abstract ideas but specific, nameable things that must be identified precisely to be respected, by yourself as much as by anyone else. A person who says only that they need better boundaries at work without naming the specific behavior, the specific colleague, the specific moment they keep failing to address, has not named the guardian. Vague intentions do not pass any gate. The Egyptians understood that specificity was the price of passage, and modern people who wonder why their vague resolutions keep failing are running into the exact same locked gate. The successful dead do not simply survive the underworld. They become identified with Osiris himself, absorbed into the very principle they were judged by. This is the most radical part of the entire text and the part Jung would have found most familiar. Individuation does not end with a person defeating their shadow. It ends with the shadow being integrated so completely that it becomes indistinguishable from the whole self, no longer an enemy to defeat but a component finally accounted for. A person who has spent years working through a difficult relationship with their own anger does not end the process by eliminating anger entirely. They end it by knowing exactly where it comes from, exactly what triggers it, and exactly how to use its energy without being ruled by it. That integration, not eradication, is what the Egyptians pictured as becoming one with the very judge who once threatened to devour the unexamined heart. None of this requires believing in an afterlife or a literal underworld. What it requires is taking seriously the idea that ancient civilizations were not naive about the mind. They built an entire liturgical system around the observation that an unexamined self becomes dangerous to itself and everyone around it, and that the only remedy is repeated, disciplined, specific confrontation with what you would rather not name. Jung spent his career translating that same observation into clinical language, but the underlying claim never changed. What you refuse to weigh will still weigh on you. What you refuse to name will still guard the gate. The Egyptians built rituals to force the confrontation early. Most modern people wait for a crisis to force it instead, which is a far more expensive way to learn the same lesson. The Book of the Dead was never really a guide for the dead. It was a rehearsal, performed by the living, for a confrontation every person eventually faces whether they prepare for it or not. Jung spent his life arguing the same point from the opposite direction, that the unconscious will present its bill eventually, and the only choice a person actually has is whether to weigh the heart honestly now, in small daily reckonings, or be forced into a much harsher accounting later, at a gate they never learned to name. The feather was never about being light in a naive or innocent sense. It was about carrying nothing you have not already confessed to yourself. That is not an ancient superstition. It is a discipline still available to anyone willing to perform the weighing before life forces the issue.